amidst the sterile white tiles of the ER and the deafening roars of a Brioni-clad, Dawn-seasoned surgeons scrambled for their lives. The city's most dangerous crime syndicate had just breached the hospital doors, yet one lone Omega doctor, armed with merely a scalpel and a devastating secret, held his ground against a room full of frenzied alphas. The graveyard shift at St. Jude's Private Medical Center was usually a sanctuary of quiet predictability. For Dr. Nathaniel Hayes, it was the only time he could practice medicine without the suffocating politics of his secondary gender hanging over his head. At 32, Nate was a rarity, a registered Omega who had clawed his way through a ruthlessly alpha-dominated medical field to become the lead attending physician in trauma. He survived by masking his natural scent with prescription suppressants and burying himself in his work, hiding behind a stoic clinical facade. It was 3:14 a.m. on a rain-slicked Tuesday when that facade was put to the ultimate test. The disruption began, not with a siren, but with the screeching of high-performance tires. 3 armored Mercedes-Benz G-Class SUVs jumped the curb, smashing through the designated ambulance drop-off zone. Before the automatic sliding doors could fully part, they were violently shattered by the butt of a tactical Glock 19. Then came the smell. It hit the emergency room like a physical shockwave. Alpha pheromones, thick, chaotic, and saturated with primal distress. The air in the triage center instantly grew heavy, laced with the scent of ozone-burnt espresso and the unmistakable metallic tang of fresh blood. It was a dominant command, wrapped in raw panic, a biological weapon that immediately triggered the submission instincts of every beta and omega in the vicinity. Even the alpha doctors were affected. Dr. Wellington, a senior attending, who usually paraded his dominance around the ward, dropped his clipboard, his face draining of color as the intruders flooded the lobby. There were 6 of them, all towering, broad-shouldered men in ruined designer suits. But the epicenter of the suffocating pressure came from the man at the front, Domhnall Rousseau, the head of the Rousseau Syndicate, a man whose name was whispered in fear across the eastern seaboard. His bespoke Brioni suit jacket was discarded, his crisp white dress shirt stained deep crimson. His eyes were wide, feral, and locked onto the medical staff like a predator cornering its prey. In his arms, he carried a teenager, his son Adrian. The boy was limp, his skin an unnatural ashen grey. Trailing closely behind Domhnall was his husband and the syndicate's brutal enforcer, Leo, gripping a submachine gun, his scent of crushed pine and gunpowder warring with Domhnall's suffocating ozone. Somebody help him. Domhnall's voice wasn't a request. It was an alpha's roar, echoing off the linoleum and rattling the remaining intact windows. I said, "Get a fucking doctor right now." The response was pure, unadulterated terror. The triage nurses, betas who had handled gunshot wounds and car wrecks with icy precision, shattered under the biological pressure. They backed away, hands raised, retreating behind the security desks. Doctor Wellington took one look at Domhnall Rousseau, looked at the heavily armed men securing the exits, and bolted for the staff stairwell. Within seconds, the bustling emergency room became a ghost town. Everyone fled. Everyone except Nathaniel. Nate's internal biology was screaming at him to drop his gaze, to bare his neck, to hide. His knees trembled as the residual scent blockers in his system fought a losing battle against the raw, concentrated alpha distress in the room. But beneath the Omega instincts was a doctor's oath, forged in iron and hardened by years of systemic doubt. He took a slow, deep breath, clinically separating his fear from his duty, and stepped out from behind the nurse's station. "Put that gun away," Nate said. His voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the chaotic shouting with the precision of a scalpel. The armed men snapped their attention to him. Leo raised his weapon, his eyes flashing dangerous gold. "You giving us orders, Doc?" "If you want that boy to live, yes," Nate replied coldly, walking directly into the storm of their pheromones without breaking eye contact with the Don. He gestured to Trauma Bay, the heavy double doors standing open. "Put him on the gurney. Now!" Dominel hesitated, his feral alpha instincts warring with his desperation as a father. He sneered, a deep growl vibrating in his chest, attempting to force this insolent, slender doctor into submission. The pressure in the room spiked, dense enough to make Nate's ears pop. But Nate merely crossed his arms, tapping his foot against the sterile floor. "Every second you stand there trying to assert dominance is a second your son bleeds out from the inside." Nate stated his tone flat, unimpressed. "Trauma Bay 1. Move." Something in Nate's unyielding posture registered in Dominel's panicked mind. The Don broke eye contact first, rushing past Nate and laying Adrian onto the crash bed. The moment Adrian hit the mattress, Nate was in his element. He snapped a pair of nitrile gloves onto his hands, moving with a fluid, practiced grace. "Get out of the way," he ordered Dominel, physically shoving the broad-shouldered alpha aside to get to the boy's chest. Dominel snarled but backed up a step. He collapsed. He was burning up, screaming about his head, and then he just started coughing up blood. "Who shot him? Did he ingest something? Fix him!" Nate ignored the interrogation. He grabbed a pair of trauma shears and cut away Adrian's soaked designer shirt. He expected to find a bullet hole, a stab wound, or the telltale rash of severe chemical poisoning. Instead, he found nothing. The boy's chest was unblemished, save for the violently rapid pounding of his heart, visible against his ribcage. "Monitor!" Nate shouted, reaching blindly behind him. Usually a nurse would be there to hand him the leads. Today he had to do it himself. He slapped the ECG pads onto Adrian's chest, the machine instantly coming to life with a frantic, erratic screech. Heart rate 190, blood pressure bottoming out at 70/40, temp 104.5 degrees Fahrenheit. "He's going into shock," Leo barked, crowding the space, his hand resting instinctively on his holster. "I can see that," Nate snapped, flashing a pen light into Adrian's eyes. The pupils were dilated to the rim, completely unresponsive to light. And then Nate smelled it. Beneath the suffocating stench of Dominel and Leo's alpha distress, there was a faint, sickly sweet scent rising from the boy's skin. It smelled like sour milk and burning cedar. It was a scent Nate knew intimately, one he had spent his entire adult life studying and masking in himself. It was the scent of a violently botched presentation. "He's an unpresented Omega," Nate said, his voice dropping an octave as he turned to look at the two Mafia bosses. Dominel's face hardened. "He's an alpha. He's a Russo." "Biology doesn't care about your last name, Mr. Russo," Nate retorted, pulling a massive syringe from the supply cart. "He is trying to present as an Omega, but his body is fighting a chemical blockade. It's tearing his internal organs apart." "What did you give him?" Silence fell over the trauma bay, thick and dangerous. The heart monitor continued its frantic, high-pitched chirping. "I asked you a question," Nate yelled, slamming the stainless steel tray. "His kidneys are failing. His liver is in toxicity overdrive. He is experiencing a Class 4 pheromone storm. If you don't tell me what is in his bloodstream right now, he will be dead in 4 minutes." Leo looked at Dominel, a silent conversation passing between the two dangerous men. Finally, Dominel unbuttoned his cuffs, his face a mask of furious grief. "Xylophone. And beta blockers. High dosage." Nate froze, his blood running cold. Xylophone was a black-market military-grade suppressant. It was designed to temporarily mask an alpha's scent during covert ops, but when given to a developing Omega, it acted like a slow-acting acid to their endocrine system. They hadn't just been hiding his presentation, they had been chemically castrating his secondary gender to force him to appear as a beta or a late-blooming alpha. "You didn't protect him," Nate whispered, his medical detachment briefly fracturing. "You poisoned him." "Watch your fucking mouth!" Dominel roared, the grief morphing into explosive violence. In a blink, he drew his Glock, stepping forward and pressing the cold steel barrel directly against the center of Nate's forehead. "You don't judge me. You save my son, or you die in this room." Nate didn't flinch. The heavy gold Patek Philippe watch on Dominel's wrist ticked loudly inches from Nate's ear. The alpha pheromones in the room were so dense that Nate's own body began to ache, his suppressed Omega nature screaming in agony under the threat of a dominant alpha. Slowly, deliberately, Nate leaned his forehead harder against the barrel of the gun. "Shoot me," Nate said, his voice dangerously soft. "Shoot me, Dominel, and watch your son drown in his own blood. Because I am the only doctor left in this building, and I am the only one who knows the exact titration of naloxone and epinephrine required to flush that poison out of an Omega's nervous system without triggering a fatal cardiac arrest." Dominel's hand shook. The Mafia boss, a man who had ordered the executions of dozens, looked into the eyes of a supposedly subservient Omega and found a wall of absolute, unbreakable steel. Beep. 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 The monitor flatlined. Adrian's back arched off the table, a violent seizure taking hold of his failing body. "Move!" Nate roared violently, swatting the gun away from his face. The sudden motion snapped Dominel out of his trance. The Don stumbled back as Nate grabbed the crash cart. "Pushing 2 milligrams of epi," Nate shouted to the empty room, forced to verbalize his actions to keep his own panic at bay. He injected the adrenaline straight into Adrian's IV line, immediately following it with a heavy flush of naloxone to strip the xylophone from the boy's receptors. But it wasn't enough. Adrian's body was caught in a biological war. The chemical flush was shocking his heart, but his suppressed Omega instincts were thrashing, blindly terrified, and lacking an anchor. To survive a presentation, this violent an Omega needed a pack, a safe harbor of pheromones to guide their nervous system back to baseline. He had none. The room was flooded with the aggressive, terrified sense of his alpha fathers, the very sense that had driven his body into hiding in the first place. Nate looked at the boy, then at the monitor. He had a choice to make. He could let nature take its course, keeping his own secret safe, or he could break the one rule he had sworn to uphold since his medical residency. Gritting his teeth, Nate reached behind his neck and ripped off the discreet, flesh-colored dermal patch that pumped scent blockers into his bloodstream. Within seconds, the sterile smell of the hospital room was utterly consumed. A wave of pure, concentrated Omega pheromones, the scent of blooming lavender, cool mint and deep grounding earth, flooded the trauma bay. It wasn't submissive, it was maternal protective and overwhelmingly commanding in its own right. Dominel and Leo physically staggered back, their alpha instincts completely short-circuiting at the sudden immense power of the Omega in the room. They watched in stunned silence as the fierce, unyielding doctor leaned over their dying son, wrapping his hands around the boy's face. "Come back, Adrian," Nate whispered, his scent blanketing the room, suffocating the violence, burying the panic. "You're safe. I've got you. Present for me." The flatline tone wavered. "Beep, beep, beep." The jagged line on the cardiac monitor spiked, hitching once before settling into a rapid yet steady sinus tachycardia rhythm. The agonizing, bone-rattling seizure that had gripped Adrian's frame ceased, leaving the boy gasping for air against the sterile sheets. The heavy, oppressive atmosphere in Trauma Bay, one fundamentally shifted. The raw, terrifying edge of Dominel and Leo's alpha distress was neutralized, smothered by the overwhelming, grounding waves of Nate's unfiltered pheromones. For an Omega to forcefully project their scent required immense biological energy, a deliberate shedding of all social and physical conditioning. Nate stood over the boy, his hands trembling slightly, sweat beading on his forehead, as he anchored the terrified teenager's nervous system. Slowly, beneath the heavy scent of blooming lavender and damp earth that Nate projected, a new fragrance emerged. It was fragile and sweet, the scent of bruised vanilla petals and the ozone-heavy smell of rain on asphalt. Adrian was presenting. The chemical barricade had been broken, and his body was finally doing what nature intended. Nate kept his hands on the sides of Adrian's face, his thumbs gently stroking the boy's cheekbones. "That's it," Nate murmured, his voice adopting a hypnotic, deeply resonant cadence that bypassed human logic and spoke directly to the boy's primal brain. "Breathe through it. The burning will stop. You are safe here." Dominel Russo, a man who commanded legions of hardened criminals, stood entirely frozen. The Glock 19 dangled uselessly from his fingertips, his golden alpha eyes blown wide in shock. Beside him, Leo looked equally paralyzed, the submachine gun lowered. They had spent their entire lives in a world that viewed Omegas as fragile, submissive commodities, to be protected, controlled, or traded. Yet standing before them was an Omega physician who had not only resisted their combined weaponized dominance, but had overpowered it, pulling their son back from the brink of absolute biological failure. Nate stepped back only when Adrian's breathing deepened into the steady rhythm of a medically induced sleep. The crisis had passed. The presentation was secured. Nate turned to face the two mobsters. He didn't bother replacing his scent blocker patch. It was ruined anyway, and he needed his pheromones to keep the boy stable. He leaned against the stainless steel supply cart, crossing his arms, looking utterly exhausted, but unbroken. "He will survive," Nate stated, his voice returning to its sharp, clinical baseline. "But his endocrine system is severely damaged. He will need weeks of specialized hormone therapy and a stable, non-aggressive pack environment to recover fully." Dominel holstered his weapon, his hands visibly shaking as he stepped toward the gurney. He reached out his massive, blood-stained fingers, gently brushing Adrian's pale forehead. The sharp, aggressive scent of the Don softened into something profoundly mournful. "We didn't know," Leo said, his voice a gravelly whisper, stepping up beside his husband. We thought he was just a late blooming alpha." The family doctor prescribed him a daily supplement to help jumpstart his system. He said it was a standard testosterone booster. Nate's eyes narrowed, his analytical mind immediately catching the discrepancy. A standard booster doesn't contain military-grade xylophone. A booster wouldn't cause a Class 4 pheromone storm. Someone intentionally poisoned him, Mr. Russo. Someone who knew he was an unpresented Omega and wanted to kill him before he could claim his birthright. Dominel's head snapped up, a lethal, chilling stillness settling over his features. The mourning father vanished, instantly replaced by the ruthless head of the syndicate. "Dr. Rossi." Dominel snarled the name, dripping with venom. "He's been our family physician for 20 years. He answers only to me, and to my brother Lorenzo." The puzzle pieces snapped together with horrifying clarity. Lorenzo Russo, the volatile underboss who had always coveted Dominel's seat at the head of the table. In traditional Mafia syndicates, an Omega heir was often viewed as a weakness, a target to be married off rather than a leader to be respected. If Adrian presented as an Omega, Lorenzo could rally the traditionalist capos to challenge Dominel's lineage. By chemically killing the boy and making it look like a tragic biological failure, Lorenzo would have eliminated the heir and kept his own hands clean. Your brother tried to assassinate your son from the inside out, Nate concluded, checking Adrian's IV line with forced nonchalance. I suggest you reevaluate your family ties. Before Dominel could respond, the heavy, reinforced doors of the emergency room lobby shuddered. The muffled sound of heavy-caliber gunfire echoed from the triage entrance, shattering the fragile quiet of the hospital. Leo instantly raised his submachine gun, positioning himself between the trauma bay doors and Adrian's bed. "Dominel!" Leo barked, his combat instincts flaring. "That's not the police." Dominel drew his Glock, his jaw clenched so tight it looked ready to fracture. "Lorenzo's men. They must have had a tail on us. They know Adrian didn't die at the estate and they've come to finish the job." Nate stared at the double doors, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had just saved the boy's life, sacrificing his career and his meticulously crafted secret in the process. Now the Mafia's civil war had literally broken down his hospital doors. "Lockdown." Nate whispered, his mind racing through St. Jude's emergency protocols. He lunged toward the wall panel, slamming his palm against the large red button. Instantly, thick steel shutters began descending over the triage windows, and the heavy magnetic locks on the trauma bay doors engaged with a loud thud. Warning sirens wailed, bathing the hallways in flashing red light. "That buys us exactly 3 minutes before they blow the magnetic locks," Nate said, turning to Dominel and Leo. "You two need to hold that corridor. If they breach this room, the crossfire will kill him. We aren't leaving his side." Dominel growled, his protective instincts surging. "If you stay in here, you make him a target," Nate shouted, stepping fully into Dominel's space, using his commanding Omega scent to force the Alpha to listen. "You are the head of a syndicate. Act like it. Secure the perimeter. I will keep him alive." Dominel stared into Nate's defiant eyes for a fraction of a second before nodding sharply. "If anything happens to him, Doctor, save your threats for the men actually trying to kill him," Nate interrupted, pushing Dominel toward the door. "Go." The moment Dominel and Leo slipped through the heavy doors, engaging the magnetic locks behind them, Nate moved into hyperdrive. The trauma bay was now a bunker, but bullets could still penetrate drywall. He grabbed the heavy lead-lined X-ray vests from the rack and began layering them over Adrian's unconscious form, creating a makeshift bulletproof shield over the boy's vital organs. Outside in the corridor, the war began. The deafening chatter of automatic weapons tore through the silence of St. Jude's. Nate heard Leo's aggressive tactical shouting, followed by the sickening thud of bodies hitting the linoleum floor. The air filtering through the vents was thick with the scent of gunpowder-shattered drywall and the copper stench of blood. Nate crouched low beside the gurney, gripping a heavy metal oxygen tank with white-knuckled intensity, ready to swing at anyone who came through that door. His Omega instincts, usually telling him to hide, were entirely overridden by the fierce, protective drive to defend his patient. He flooded the small room with his calming scent, hoping it would seep under the door and ground Dominel and Leo in the chaos outside. Crack. A stray bullet punched through the reinforced glass of the trauma bay door, spiderwebbing the pane and burying itself into the ceiling above Nate's head. Plaster rained down on his shoulders. He didn't flinch. He kept one hand firmly on Adrian's pulse, feeling the steady, reassuring beat beneath his fingertips. Over the hospital's intercom system, the panicked voice of Administrator Gallagher suddenly crackled to life, echoing through the war zone. "To the armed individuals in the ER police SWAT teams are 3 minutes away. Stand down immediately." The announcement was met with a renewed hail of gunfire. Lorenzo's hit squad knew their time was up. It was a desperate final push to breach the doors. "Leo covering fire." Dominel's roar vibrated through the walls. Nate squeezed his eyes shut as a massive explosion, likely a frag grenade, shook the foundation of the hospital. The lights flickered, died, and then the emergency generators kicked in, bathing the trauma bay in a dim, eerie amber glow. And then silence. The heavy, suffocating quiet was almost worse than the gunfire. Nate held his breath, his grip tightening on the oxygen tank. He listened for footsteps. He heard the crunch of boots on broken glass, slow and deliberate, approaching the trauma bay doors. The handle turned. The magnetic lock, damaged by the explosion, clicked and gave way. Nate raised the heavy steel tank, his muscles coiling. The door swung open, revealing Dominel Russo. His bespoke suit was in ruins, soaked in blood, most of it not his own. His face was smeared with soot, and he favored his left leg, but his golden eyes were bright and focused. Behind him, Leo stood guard, checking the magazines of his weapon. The hallway behind them, littered with the bodies of Lorenzo's assassins. Dominel took one look at Nate, poised with the oxygen tank, like a warrior over his fallen son. The lead X-ray vests carefully draped over Adrian. The sheer defiance and protective fury radiating from the slender doctor left the Mafia boss speechless. Slowly, Dominel lowered his weapon. He didn't walk into the room with the swagger of a don. He walked in with the exhaustion of a father who had almost lost everything. He approached the gurney, staring down at Adrian, whose breathing remained steady, his new vanilla and rain scent filling the amber-lit room. Dominel turned to Nate. To Nate's absolute shock, the most feared alpha on the eastern seaboard dropped to one knee, bowing his head. "You saved my blood." Dominel said, his voice thick with emotion, stripping away all pride and dominance. "You stood against my anger. You stood against my enemies. And you gave my son his life back." Leo stepped into the room, leaning heavily against the doorframe, and nodded in profound respect. "The Russo family owes you a debt that cannot be repaid in money, Doctor. If Lorenzo's men saw your face, you are in danger. Your life here is over. They will come for you." Nate lowered the oxygen tank, the adrenaline finally beginning to drain from his system, leaving a bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. He looked at the wreckage of his trauma bay, the shattered glass, and the blood on his scrubs. He knew Leo was right. By revealing his secondary gender and defying Lorenzo's hitmen, he had painted a massive target on his back. His career at Sancto, Jude's, was over. Administrator Gallagher would undoubtedly fire him the moment the SWAT teams cleared the building, using the Mafia shootout as an excuse to purge an Omega from his elite surgical staff. "I am not going into hiding," Nate said firmly, pulling off his bloody nitrile gloves and throwing them in the hazardous waste bin. "And I am not becoming property of the Russo syndicate either." Dominel stood up, wincing slightly at his injured leg. "Then name your terms. Anything you want, Doctor. It is yours." Nate looked down at Adrian. He thought of all the unpresented Omegas out there, forced to hide, poisoned by suppression drugs, and treated as second-class citizens by the medical establishment. He thought of the decades he had spent, hiding his own true nature just to hold a scalpel. "I want a clinic," Nate demanded, locking eyes with the Mafia boss. "Fully funded, untraceable, and protected by your men. A sanctuary for Omegas who have been chemically suppressed or abused. I will run it my way with my own staff. You will supply the black market medical equipment, and you will ensure that Lorenzo's faction never sets foot near it." A slow, genuine smile spread across Dominel Russo's bruised face. It was the smile of a predator recognizing an equal. A medical fortress for Omegas, run by a doctor who holds a trauma bay hostage. I like the sound of that. Do we have a deal, Mr. Russo? Nate asked, extending a clean hand. Dominell took it, his massive, calloused grip sealing the pact. We have a deal, Dr. Hayes. Welcome to the family. In the distance, the wail of police sirens finally cut through the stormy night, growing louder as they converged on St. Jude's. But inside the shattered trauma bay, a new empire was quietly being built. The era of the submissive, fragile Omega was dead buried beneath the rubble of the hospital corridor, replaced by a doctor who proved that true dominance had nothing to do with alpha pheromones and everything to do with a refusal to break. What a wild, adrenaline-fueled ride. Dr. Nate Hayes proved that real strength isn't about biology. It's about the courage to stand your ground when everyone else runs away. Do you think Nate made the right choice by striking a deal with the Russo Syndicate, or is he playing with fire? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you loved this intense Omegaverse drama, hit that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe for more gripping stories.